I'm Jeanette, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here and to have been invited by Reading in Motion. I think that the mission of the organization really matches really well with what my research agenda is like, both personally and professionally. So what I'd like to do over the next couple of minutes is I've had a chance to talk with 3 of the 4 tables. So the last table I think will have the added benefit of hearing a lot of what I already do and asking me additional questions about that. But essentially, I think a focus on the early grades, and like Reading in Motion is really focused at kinder and first grade, is so important because you really have the opportunity, at least, to do something that's really meaningful as opposed to trying to fill in gaps and knowledge gaps. And so that's a really important time. And, I would definitely argue you can start that as early as pre-K and actually in utero, right? Speaking of which, one person asked me when I was due, and I think probably people are looking at me like, you're traveling
not tonight,
at the airline. No, not tonight. Yeah, they said, are you sure you can travel? I said, yes. My doctors know this is actually the last week I can travel. So I was very happy to be able to make it. Everything went really smoothly, so it was meant to be.
We were so happy to see you.
Yeah, for many reasons, coming from California, with the weather, how it can be really crazy. But anyhow, I have 7 weeks to go, so hopefully I will wait 7 more weeks. There's a lot to be done before that time. With that said, so I think what I will do, and might be informative and interesting maybe for you all, is tell you a little bit about my personal background and kind of how my personal background has really shaped my academic trajectory. And then walk you through some of the studies that I've conducted, some of the challenges that I've heard, and experiences that I've had, because I've been fortunate enough to have experiences in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and in the West Coast, all with linguistically diverse children. So personally, my parents are immigrants from Mexico. I was born and raised in California, but my demographic profile, if you were just going to look at me in that way, would be very similar to what a lot of you have in your schools, maybe to what some of you have experienced yourself. And by that I mean a child of immigrants from low-income homes in a neighborhood where there was a good amount of crime, kind of just widespread poverty. So the profile would have been one that, well, your chances of academic success and such are pretty low. And so, of course, no one, and I think especially a room of educators, would like to think of things in that way. But the truth is that oftentimes we look at averages and, okay, on average, what does this look like and what would we predict for you? I actually had a son at the age of 15. So I told, I think, table 3 that I have a 20-year-old. And so they said, how's that possible? You look too young. I said, well, I was too young. And so that adds another layer to this kind of piece of, oh, well, now I definitely think you're not going to graduate from high school. You're definitely not going to go on to college and get a doctorate degree. Not that Harvard is the end-all be-all, but you're not going to end up at Harvard. And so that's not what happened in my life. So the resilience factor is one thing that we really, I think, need to keep in the back of our minds. And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a bit here because we're all educators, and I think we all believe in that, at least philosophically, right? So I share that with you, not because you just want to know my personal story, but because that really has shaped who I am as a person in terms of thinking about children and their potential. And so when I was fortunate enough to graduate with my graduating class, I have an older sister and a younger. I was the first one to go to college and graduate. Then the first one to go on to get a master's degree and then a doctorate degree. And that was all with the help of my family and the support, in fact, of a lot of educators that along the way were really supportive of my development. And so I decided, from a pretty early age that I wanted to be a teacher. I didn't really know what that meant, right? Especially when I was in high school. It would be nice to teach. But when I was an undergrad student, I thought, yeah, I definitely want to teach at the elementary school level. I think this would be really great. And so I went to school at Mount St. Mary's in Los Angeles, a local school. I had a son at the time, so I was not dorming. And so, I had the support of my parents. And I ended up teaching at the same elementary school that actually fired me as a tutor because I was pregnant. And so, kind of life takes interesting turns. So the same principal ended up hiring me, and I was there for a year, and this was the same school I had attended as a child. So then the demographic profile hadn't changed very much. It was still pretty much Latinos from low-income homes, immigrant communities. And I purposely, after 1 year there, I taught at first grade. I decided that I wanted to teach at a different context and get a general sense of what happens in a school that's more diverse, because the school that I taught at was not diverse. A lot of people say, what a diverse school? Well, not really. Almost everyone 100% Latino, 100% low income, maybe not 100, but 90 plus. you get the sense of what I'm talking about. So I went to a different school district that was more diverse economically and linguistically, and I taught there at the kindergarten level and then 4th grade. And I was the only Latina teacher at that school because the demographic profile of the district in general was so different. Having been there, especially in the 4th grade experience, was very life-changing for me in the sense that I imagine many of you have heard of this 4th grade slump in reading, and that's really what I saw in 4th grade. So if you remember, I had taught 1st grade, I had taught kindergarten, and along the way I changed every summer and taught a different grade. So I got a full spectrum from, just a couple of years, and I did that purposely. Because in the back of my mind, I had the idea that I may go to graduate school at some point. So in 4th grade, to make a long story short, is where I really saw this gap in vocabulary with my children. And so in comprehension in particular, I think it was with folks in Table 3 we were talking about, that there's so much that goes into what makes someone a successful reader, someone who can comprehend text. And we can, have a long, long list and add to it. But 2 essential components that are non-negotiable are children need to know how to decode the words, and they need to know the meanings of those words. If they don't get those 2 pieces in place, and a lot goes into, of course, each of those 2 pieces, then you can't really say they have text, they can comprehend text, right? And so what I was seeing was exactly that the word reading skills were up to par, but the vocabulary was just not there. So some of my children, and I'm here talking about not just ELLs, but some of my other students that were from monolingual English-speaking homes, oftentimes they can, read for me out loud just great, and you ask them what that passage was about, no idea. And so I thought, okay, I'm not equipped to do this. Like, I don't know what to do at this point. How do I help them develop comprehension skills? And that's what led me to graduate school. And so I ended up at the Harvard Graduate School of Education because I thought I wanted to become a reading specialist. And so my idea was I need to be better equipped with the knowledge and skills so that I can help my students with reading comprehension, because at that point I felt like I was at a loss. And so I did go into the program. But as soon as I got there, I really felt like it was a 1-year program, which was an appeal, right? Because a lot of master's programs were 2 years. But within maybe literally 3 to 4 weeks, I thought, there's no way after 1 year I'm going to know enough about reading development. So I applied to the doctoral program, and what was to be 1 year turned into 6. So my family was not happy. They're in California, remember. And now I was in Massachusetts with my son. And so they thought, oh, why can't you at least come to Stanford, right, at least, because that would be, a little closer to home. But when it was all said and done, it was a great experience because 5 years of doctoral studies, I was able to work on several federally funded studies, all anchored on language and literacy development, and specifically on children from Spanish-speaking homes. And I've said that to some of you that I've already spoken with, that I am in no way suggesting Spanish is the only other language there is for ELLs, but it is the one that is most common to a lot of our English language learners. But I fully acknowledge that there's, hundreds of languages represented in our school district, and that complicates things, which I hopefully will get to in a second. The point being that my experience, as Carl mentioned in the introduction, has really been starting with kids as young as age 2 and going into the end of middle school. So I haven't really gotten into the high school years yet, but essentially from ages 2 to about 14. And so very developmental in the sense that I really am interested in tracking what their vocabulary, word reading, reading comprehension skills are like in terms of their trajectories over time. So most of my research is longitudinal, and the bulk of it, almost all of it, is very quantitatively focused. And what that means is not that I don't think the qualitative aspect matters. I definitely think it matters a whole lot. And in fact, some of my more recent studies are incorporating more mixed methods approaches to really understand the context in which language and literacy is unfolding. But a lot of it has really been using test scores, for example, whether they're individually administered or like tests that are required statewide and such. And so I can walk you through a lot of those results, but really what I wanted to tell you is that I at least want to start with a common understanding of this term English language learner, which there's so many terms that are thrown around, and they all have some meaning behind it. They're not really arbitrary. And so, do all of you know what an English language learner is? Does somebody want to tell me what an English language learner is?
It's not defined yet. According to Common Core, it's not defined yet.
What an English language learner is? So you think we have no notion of what this...
They leave it to the states to define it.
Okay.
To every single state to define it.
Yeah, but in general, if you hear ELL, because all of us hear ELL, and we're like, we kind of know, right, what an ELL is. So what would you say? And I don't mean you in particular, if you don't want to, either one. But how would someone say this is what an ELL is?
When English is not the first language.
When English is not the first language. I think, yeah, that's, and this was not a trick question. The thing is that, yeah, I'm sure you've heard limited English proficient, dual language learner, English language learner, second language learner. I mean, the list can kind of go on and on. But the basic fundamental idea is that, or language minority learner, have any of you heard of that? I like language minority learner only because it's not tied into a specific designation that is given based on the school identification. So, so the biggest umbrella term I think right now would be a child that's a language minority learner, and that just means that they come from a home in which English is not the native language or not the only language used. So, you know, anyone who's an LM learner would be anyone who is someone other than a monolingual English speaker. Monolingual totally. There's no one else in the household who speaks any other language. And so that's a big difference from someone who's limited English proficient, because now you're talking about the school designation, which you get tested, you get some kind of a score, and they let you know, okay, are you at the beginning level, intermediate, whatever it may be. So language minority learner could be someone who's dominant and most proficient in English and maybe has minimal proficiency in another language, but the point is that developmentally their experience is fundamentally different than a monolingual English speaker because they've been exposed to a language other than English to some extent at some point in their childhood. Does that make sense? And so my work focuses on the big umbrella language minority learner and also on this. And so for language minority learners, I may not be getting this 100% right, so don't quote me, but there are about 11 million children in the U.S. that are language minority learner. If you're talking about the ELL classification, there are about 5 million. Just to give you a sense of, like, obviously there's a big difference between the two. So this group is really, I think, should be of national concern to us because their performance academically is really much lower than it is for non-ELL students. And I'm not going to bore you here with statistics and numbers. You can look at NAEP results, any kind of reading and math achievement results, and there's always a gap between children who are English language learners or, you know, more recently we're using the term dual language learner when you're referring to the children that are younger, so at the pre-K to like primary grade levels, because the idea there is that they're simultaneously learning two languages as opposed to an ELL who may have immigrated, let's say, at 5th grade or at 8th grade. So no matter how you slice it, there's gaps. And so at one level, it seems very easy to understand, well, of course there's going to be a gap. If you came from a home where English has been your sole language your entire life, and you're expected to perform on assessments in English, you probably should have somewhat of an advantage compared to a child who has not had the foundation in that same language from infancy, right? So, I mean, at a basic level, it makes sense. What doesn't make sense is when children have been schooled in the U.S. for years and years and years, in English in particular, and they're still performing at levels that are far below their native English-speaking peers. That, to me, is very troublesome and concerning and really calls for attention into what's actually happening instructionally. And so some of my work, and I've talked to some of the tables about this already, so I don't want to bore you with repetitive information, has been longitudinal with a group of kids who started preschool, in fact, not just kindergarten, but preschool in an English-only program. And by the time they get to 8th grade, they're reading far below grade level. So again, they attended preschool, they attended English-only programs. So at least one thing that we can conclude is that just by virtue of having an English-only program and attending preschool is not enough. And so that's an important finding because there's so much of a push for English-only programs nationally. I think Illinois, fortunately, is in a position where there's a lot going on with native language instruction. Now it's taking on different models, and schools are struggling in many different ways. I've talked to some of you already in that kind of specific context, but in some states like California, it's not even really an issue in the sense that you have to use English only. And unless there's enough parents who are willing to sign a waiver and have their kids instructed in the native language, that's not really an option. So I think here I'll be interested in hear some of you that I haven't heard from, or some of you that I have and we haven't talked enough about it, and kind of what's happening with the instructional model. I also mentioned that when we talk about instructional models, what's really difficult is that it's amazing to think that there's really not a lot of research on which model is better than another. Now, with that said, I mean empirical research. There's a whole lot of anecdotal evidence and people having opinions about, well, when I was growing up or my grandparents or whatever that may be, but that's based on personal experience, again, anecdotes, which, you know, I don't think that there's not a place for that, but it's very different than having some concrete data to show what works, what doesn't work. And most of the research that has been conducted really does show at least that using the native language is not going to impede, one, English language development, and number two, it is going to help with native language development. So did I get that right? Yeah. So using a native language is not going to impede English development, and it's going to help native language development. So I know some schools are using dual language programs. There's been a lot of controversy also with dual language programs because they're adopted from a Canadian model, essentially, and the Canadian context is quite different than the US context in many important ways, including the demographics of the students being served. And so I won't get into that too much unless you guys want to and I'll field questions about it. But what I'm really trying to get you to understand is that there is not right now a model that someone can point to and say, that's the one. But if there's something for you to understand, however, is that there is pretty solid evidence from a lot of researchers that using the native language is probably the appropriate thing to do. Now, how that works out is going to depend on the context of the community being served, and the mission of the school, hopefully a shared vision within the school. And there's a lot of schools that, unfortunately, it's your kids versus my kids, and that's not going to lead into anything very productive, I don't think. It's like, you know, saying these are the special ed kids and you deal with them, I deal with the mainstream, these are the ELLs, then you deal with them in some way. Even if you don't have a systematic approach and everyone feels like these are our kids, then that's going to be problematic as well. There's a lot of capacity issues in terms of teacher capacity to serve children who are non-native English speakers. I was mentioning to one of the tables that anecdotally here, I worked with a preschool program in a suburb here in Illinois, and with the new mandate for bilingual instruction at the pre-K level, you're supposed to provide native language instruction if there's 20 or more of this, that share the same native language, but they didn't have enough teachers to do that. So what you end up with is, do you turn them away because you say, well, there's not enough teachers to serve you, or do you stick them in an English-only program and say, okay, we know that technically what you're supposed to get is a native, speaking teacher, but so you're kind of left with those two alternatives. And that's a tough position to be in as a preschool director, for example. And so this preschool director decided, well, we're going to stick them in an English-only program. That's better than not giving them a preschool experience. And so what happened there is the director shared with me and a lot of the staff that because they didn't have enough qualified Spanish-speaking teachers, they were looking to other countries to bring in teachers to teach in Spanish. And some of them, for example, were from Spain, and there are some cultural differences. So here we're not just talking about linguistic similarities, but also cultural similarities that you need to take into account when you're thinking about a community that you're serving. And so, I don't want to create more like, oh man, all she's talking to us about is all the problems that are out there. But these are the realities. And so, unfortunately, I'm not here to say that. So this is the answer, but things for you to consider and really think about what kind of makes sense for particular schools. Also, what came out of that collaboration is that some of the children, so if you take your home language survey and your parent says you're from an English-only home, you're from an English-only home, right? They're not going to say, really, are you not? So you kind of take your word for it, right? So you're considered an English speaker. And some of these kids are African-American or Caucasian, for example. Some of them, of course, Latino as well. But so they're not required to take the pre-IBT, right, the oral language proficiency test. But sometimes they would administer this test just to get a gauge of their language abilities, and they would score at the limited English proficient level, which is really interesting in many ways because it really speaks to language limitations that a lot of children are coming in with, and these are kids that are mostly from low-income homes as well. I spoke to some of you about the differences in the Canadian context, for example, and the U.S., and one of them that comes out as a salient factor over and over again is income differences. And a lot, disproportionately, ELLs in the U.S. come from low-income homes. That does not mean every ELL is from a low-income home, that's for sure, but most of them really are. We know that Latinos are the largest subgroup of ELLs, and for the first time in history, they're actually the group that's the one living in poverty at the highest rates. the lowest high school graduation rates, the lowest enrollment in undergrad programs and in graduate programs. So there's like far-reaching implications to what matters here. And by the time they're in third grade, and this is kids in general, it's pretty predictive of your high school graduation rates. And so that's why I get back to the whole idea of reading in motion, focusing on K in first grade. It's really important because it matters. It's not like, oh, well, we kind of theoretically think that the early grades matter. It's like, it's a big deal. It's not a perfect correlation, but there's a pretty strong correlation between how you perform in third grade and whether or not you're going to graduate from high school. In fact, I just read a study on my way here today about being able to predict who will graduate from high school based on first grade performance, which is really sad in some ways and really pushes towards this whole idea of preventive efforts. And so I really read the article in kind of passing, so I can't tell you too much details about it. Carl, you nodded your head, so you may know a little more than me, actually. But the whole premise of the work is that there are some indicators that we can look at to really try to prevent certain outcomes from happening. It's not about, okay, by first grade now we're going to have labels and say, you're going to graduate, you're not, you're going to graduate, you're not. That's not the idea at all. But it's, okay, how can we work with these indicators and think of children as individuals as opposed to a group of yes graduating, no graduating. But the point is that there's tons and tons of support that keeps stemming back to this idea of focusing on the early grades. That doesn't mean we'll forget about the upper elementary school kids, middle school, etc. I'm not implying that at all. But when it comes to the education of ELLs, it's almost inevitable that you're going to get the question of language of instruction. What language should you be using? How much of it should you be using? And those are answers that, unfortunately, I don't have for you because it really depends, like I said, on the context of the school and on the vision the school would like to have, on the parent input. We talked a little bit here, I think on table 2, that sometimes the parents themselves don't want native language instruction, and that's, a lot of it stems from the social media. They get this idea that English only is the way to go. If you talk to them in your first language, you're going to impede their development in English, and that's simply not true. We want kids to be spoken to in any language. As long as they hear language, this is a good thing. We want them to be read to in any language as long as they have that literacy. And this whole idea of, capitalizing on a model like dual language immersion, the whole premise there of cross-linguistic transfer, for example, is that you have a strong foundation in the first language in order to develop that second language proficiently. It's not that you have some mediocre proficiency in the first language. And what happens again in the U.S. context, a lot of these kids have parents that have low levels of education that themselves might be illiterate. You can't assume literacy, that's for sure. And so you can't just expect that because you come from a Spanish-speaking home, you're proficient in that language, and let me provide you with Spanish materials. That doesn't work. I was a teacher, so I experienced this firsthand. I've been doing this research for a good number of years now, and I've experienced it with districts in the Northeast, in the Midwest, in the West Coast. So there's a lot that goes into this idea of, capitalizing on your first language. The truth is, it's ideal, but you have to develop that first language and literacy in order to produce long-term effects that are going to be beneficial for English language development. The other thing is that I also mentioned that every program is focused on English language development. There is no such thing as a bilingual program that does not focus on ensuring that children are proficient in English. And that's a misconception sometimes that parents have, thinking, well, if my child is in a bilingual program, they're not going to learn English. Well, first of all, I've yet to see any child who is in the U.S. that does not know English. Now, if we're talking about academic vocabulary, having really sophisticated language structures, that's a different ballgame, but everyone develops some proficiency in English, right? And I've never heard a parent say, I really hope my child does not learn English. I want them to be, only Spanish monolingual. And that's something that a lot of advocates of English only say, well, then we're not going to get them into English, and what's going to happen, they're going to, not acculturate and all of these things. So all of that, there's, are all of you familiar with Linda Espinosa? Okay, if you're not, that's a good one to know. That's a good person to know about. She has a lot of myths, common myths or common misconceptions about English language learners or bilingual education generally. And so I won't tell you all of the myths, but some are like all ELLs are immigrants. That's not true. They're a very, very heterogeneous population. Some of the myths are that, you know, if you assess them in English, well, why worry about the first language? If there's a lot of languages represented, you can't possibly teach in the native language, so English only is the way to go. And there's answers to all of these things. I'm not going to focus on these myths too much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have if there's a myth or misconception that you're really concerned about or, you know, want some answers to. But the bottom line is that I kind of wanted to get a sense from you all, where do you get your information about ELLs, development, etc.? How are you informed?
You've had that unique opportunity to really focus on each Hispanic community, large, Midwest and California. How is it different? How is it?
Yeah, so one of the comments, so what happens is in the Northeast, a lot of the families were from the Dominican Republic and from, you know, the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, and some from Central America, South America, but predominantly Dominican, Puerto Rican. And then when I was in Chicago, it was mostly Mexican origin, and same thing in California, mostly Mexican origin, but a good amount from El Salvador and Guatemala, for example. And one of the things that stands out to me, because my work is so anchored on vocabulary, and I'll get to that in a second, why I feel that's so important, is that the vocabulary differences in terms of regional differences within the Spanish community are so vast. And so some of the work that I've done with the toddlers, so these are the kids from like ages 2 to 4 roughly, we were developing an inventory because there was one in English, but there was not a counterpart in Spanish, and we really wanted to tap into vocabulary at that young age. And so we started developing it and then really ran into all sorts of issues, not just psychometrically in terms of how reliably the test was, you know, performing, the validity of it, but just the actual content of the words. So one word that meant something in Mexico meant something completely different in El Salvador or in the Dominican Republic. And so and I have to admit that I was pretty ignorant on that front myself. I just thought, okay, well, we do this, we pick these words. I'm from Mexican origin home, so I'm pretty sure that the words I would have come up with are going to be based on Mexican origin. And then I had a lot of colleagues who are from Peru or other places like, no, that's not how it works. And if we don't pay attention to that, and here goes back to this issue of like test validity, and are you tapping into the right construct, we could just go down the list and say, nope, this person doesn't know it, when conceptually they know what that concept is. I'm just using the wrong label for it. And so that's one of the things that across the board stood out to me in terms of paying attention to these regional differences in vocabulary. And this is within a language that people think, well, you're a Spanish speaker, so Spanish is the same. And so, you know, the same could be said about English. I mean, certainly there's vocabulary, you know, lexical entries that you use in the Northeast that you may not use in the Midwest or in California, or whatever it may be in the South. So that's one. In terms of differences, in commonalities, unfortunately, it's really distilled because my work is focused on what is important for reading comprehension development. As I told you, I've really been focused on the notion of oral language, not just vocabulary, but in terms of something like working memory, where children repeat phrases that you say, with syntactic abilities, morphology, and all of that, and with word reading development as like two big constructs that are important for comprehension. And across the board, it doesn't matter where I am, there's a big vocabulary gap. And that vocabulary gap is something that I'm continuing to focus my career on. And the projects that I'm working on now are really focused on vocabulary for ELLs in particular, because it's a gap that I think we have in classrooms for any learner, without question. Because it doesn't mean that, oh, monolingual English speakers are just doing fantastic on vocabulary, but there's even a bigger gap with those that are from non-native English-speaking homes. And I don't think we know enough instructionally about vocabulary. Most of the work is really anchored on monolingual English speakers, and that tends to be the case for a lot of work that we do, versus with monolinguals, and then, okay, how does this apply to non-native English speakers? Someone had asked about intervention and, you know, that sort of thing. Same thing, it's all been kind of anchored with monolingual English speakers. We're now trying to test out the waters and see what does this look like for ELLs. But the point is that we really don't know how should you instruct it vocabulary-wise. How do you develop children's language skills? It's far harder than developing their word reading skills, I would argue, because with word reading, I mentioned earlier I think table 1, you have a certain number of letters in the alphabet, a certain number of sounds that those letters make. And so to some level it's very teachable. Doesn't mean every child is going to get it, but it's more finite in terms of teaching the word level skills. When you talk about vocabulary, it's a whole different beast. Now you're talking about entries that you can't really pinpoint your finger on. You can't say, well, if you know 100 words, hypothetically, in a year, now you're good. Or if you know 1,000, now you're good. And which kind of words matter at kindergarten versus in second grade or in fifth grade, and how do you really teach those words? And so these are the things that people are paying a little more attention to. I know that I am. So one of the studies that I'm working on now, it's with the preschool, and what I'm doing is I have, it's called the Lena software. And it's based out of Hart and Risley's work. So some of you may be familiar with Hart and Risley's, this meaningful differences in vocabulary. That really show that children from welfare families compared to middle class or professional, as you might imagine, the vocabulary went higher and higher depending on your family SES. There's been similar work conducted with monolingual Spanish speakers and Spanish-English bilinguals showing the effect of SES on vocabulary acquisition. And so what they developed is this software called the Lena, and it's essentially a digital device, a recorder. And the idea behind it is a little funny because it was, okay, we're going to put these devices on parents so that they're aware of the language that they're using with their kids, but they cost like $400, right? And really, are you going to have most low-income parents go and play this device for $400 and put it on their children and themselves to record their vocabulary and, you know, download the software? So it's a little weird. But a lot of researchers have now started using it for research purposes, and I have. And so what I'm doing is I'm having children, preschoolers, wear the device during the school day, and the teacher wear the device, which was hard to get the teachers to say yes. And I can totally imagine if someone said, can I put a recorder on you, me, and like I'm just going to transcribe what you say, but what are you talking about, right? It's a little bit like intrusive. But we got enough teachers to say yes after a lot of talking with them that we're not evaluating them individually, which is absolutely true. But what my push was, if we don't get the language that's actually happening in the classroom, it's going to be very hard to penetrate any kind of meaningful intervention of what you should do. I have a pretty solid case for saying we need to focus on developing children's vocabulary, for example, but I really don't have any solid base of telling you how to do it. Now, I can pull from some of the literature here and there and say, these are some methods that seem to be a little bit better than others, but really, we don't have that data to really tell us how we should focus on vocabulary. And so my idea is that with having this recorder on the teacher and on the child, we can really get at least some preliminary information about what language, how language is being used in the classroom, which kind of interaction styles are associated with growth in language and literacy skills over time. And so I'm planning to follow these kids into the K to second grade years and see how, you know, language interaction at pre-K really relates to growth later on. And, you know, there's more details than that, but the basic idea is that we need to actually start doing some of that in order to get a good sense of what's working and what's not. 5 minutes?
15.
Oh, okay, and including the Q&A?
Yeah. Quick questions, and then we'll have dessert.
Oh, okay. So I can stop now.
It's
That was an abrupt stop, right? Okay. Well.
It's your agenda.
Okay. Well, I want to leave enough time for Q&A. So what I will do is, like I said, there's a lot more that I can talk to you about, and I'd be happy to correspond with any of you individually via, you know, conversation here, but certainly follow up on email or Skype, whatever would be helpful to you, and I mean that. So I don't think there's anything else in particular I wanted to say to you, other than to recap. We're really at a place now where I think there's enough evidence to, and I think everyone here at least is interested enough in English language learners, dual language learners to have attended tonight. And I hope that if there's one thing you take away is that unfortunately there's not a recommendation, at least not from me, to tell you this is the kind of program that you should be using. But I think it's pretty clear that if possible, you really should use the native language in the schools for your children, because that's really what's going to matter for them to acquire the English proficiency that they need. But it's all about the amount and dosage, and that's also an answer that I don't exactly have for you. We were talking in Table 3 about the fact that by 3rd grade they're going to have to take the test in English, so everyone knows that English is what you really need to get to, and you need to try to get to it as soon as possible. And so with that in mind, I'm very mindful of it, but the truth is that if we could in some way use the native language, and at the very least, try to involve parents. That's one piece that I didn't get to enough, is the parental involvement and engagement. And that does not mean just come to PTA meetings, because that's really not sufficient. Teacher professional development is another one that's usually very piecemeal. And okay, we're going to have this one here and this one do something else. And teachers kind of go, I've been there, and say like, okay, well, this was not too informative. So having more of a shared vision in the school, really knowing what's going to work for the actual characteristics of the community that you're serving, I think is at least one fundamental step. And the other thing is that when I asked about where you get your information about ELLs or any topic, I have spoken to a lot of administrators and teachers, and the truth is if you want to get data that's very recent and you want to download a journal article, for example, it could be expensive. Unless you're affiliated with the university and you have access to the database, you're probably getting a book. That a book takes longer than a peer-reviewed article to come out. So that's something that we as as researchers and practitioners really need to think about. And how do you get the information, for example, of research that I'm doing, to get it out to you as soon as possible, so you don't have to wait 3 years after it's already been conducted to know what's going on. So anyhow, I hope there were at least a couple of things here and there that I said that were informative to you. So I'll open it up now for a Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Thank you.
You brought up, you're really interested in your summary in reference to preschool. So the President's State of the Union was talking about preschool, how important it is. And then we go with this state, Illinois. The governor himself brought up the same issue, State of the State address. Most recently, we spoke to Barbara Bird Bennett, and she referred to Chicago that 46% of our children are Latinos or speak a language other than English. So how can we assist them with the knowledge base that you have with your colleagues and with research to help us? Because right now, Chicago is looking for a leader in our bilingual program citywide. They're trying to elevate it from this position to a cabinet position. So how can we help as educators in having so many children that speak a language other than English? How can we assist, or what can we do to make that foundation workable?
Okay. I'm not sure if I understand the exact nature of your question.
Basically, it's like, what can we do to provide them the right direction that you're providing us?
You mean to inform them about the...
Them, the governor?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, let's start there, huh?
Well, it seems to me, and clearly I'm not as informed as all of you are of what's going on in the context here in Illinois and in Chicago in particular, but at least from an outsider perspective now, and being in a different state, it seems that Illinois is actually probably paving the way in the right direction for a lot of this compared to some of the other states like California or Massachusetts, because at the very least you have this mandate, right? And I don't think we touched upon it here. I talked about it at one of the tables. And so having a mandate, of course, doesn't translate to practice and what's actually happening on the ground necessarily, but at least it's one step in the direction. So unless I'm mistaken, it seems to be like Illinois is very supportive, at least, of the idea of native language instruction. Now, that manifests itself in many different ways, depending at the district level, at the school level, but at least there's that notion that we should support native language instruction. That is not the case nationally, as most of you know. Nationally, it's no, we're not going to use the native language, and in fact, we're going to pass some mandates so that we don't do that, and we transition kids right away. So, the actual policy and the implementation are two different things, but I think that in fact, you're probably at a better footing than most states, at least in the direction. Illinois is usually pointed as one of the states that is the best in terms of kind of trying to pave the way. Even having the universal preschool or access, the preschool for all is a really big deal. Now we need to have some coordination between pre-K and what's going on at the K-12 level, which is a whole different beast. So I don't have a real answer for that other than to say that at least it seems that you're doing a little bit better than most other places are. Yes.
I think also teachers are also have to have the ESO endorsement. So that says itself that, they are supporting it.
Yeah, and so this is what I mean from the actual mandate to the implementation. So you have, so supposedly now there has to be this ESO endorsement, but I think July of this year here in Illinois. But is that realistically going to happen? Is the real question, right? And so at least the foundation is kind of there for this to occur. But as far as I understand it, I don't think it's really realistic that that's going to happen. That there's going to be this ESL endorsement. But the position is out there that this is what you ought to be doing. And a lot of programs, a lot of universities, I know for a fact, like UIC, are really focusing on, okay, how are we going to get this in place so that we can provide the certification. So that's at least better than not even having that mandate in place.
And they do teach you, give you articles, and then they do direct you to a lot of these articles about research about dual language or bilingual or whatever. So,
Yes.
I'd just like to comment. Well, first of all, thank Freedom in Motion for bringing this topic. I think it's very, very important that we hear more of it.
Yeah.
Because we do have a large concentration of English learners in Chicago Public Schools. And I think there's that fear of these children when they get to third grade.
Sure.
They've got to face that, English only assessment. And so for fear of ensuring that our kids are ready for that, we push the English
right away,
at a very early age. And so we're losing them down the road. And so truly believe that high school situation with dropout rate is an effect of it. So I think that, maybe in Chicago, Illinois, we're kind of opening the door for the language, to develop this native language. However, I don't think we hear enough of it. I don't think at the higher level, we're not hearing enough of the value of using native language to support the English development. And I think that you mentioned about, how do we get the research at an early stage down to the educators or to the policymakers, so they're not afraid, so that they know, if this is the way to go because research is showing this, then let's go with that. So that's important.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think I said this before, the problem is that there's really not enough studies out there comparing the instructional models and telling you this one really is better than the other. What we do kind of know is that if you provide native language instruction, it's not going to get in the way, right? Interfere with English, and it's going to help your native language. But there's really not very rigorous studies out there for a whole slew of reasons. I mean, across a same state, there's going to be so much variation in how a program is implemented. Even though you say, I use dual language, you use dual language, the way it actually is implemented on the ground can vary so much that you're not comparing apples to apples. So you can then compare that to at the state level and then across states. That makes it very different to systematically say, okay, this is what is working better than others. And a lot of folks in academia, for example, don't want to get into that debate because it's been so politicized that, okay, there's advocates of English only and there's advocates of bilingual instruction. Not everyone, but there's people at opposite ends of the pendulum who really are not listening to the argument of the other because ideologically they have their stance. They say this is the way it is, and no matter what evidence you show me, nope. And same for this camp, without really looking at what's best for the students and for their development. So it's a really difficult one. I agree with you. I mean, if we could come to some consensus in that regard, I mean, that's what I was getting at when I said that at least at the school level, if there was some kind of a shared vision, that would be kind of a step in the right direction and not your kids, my kids, and kind of separating it out that way. But yeah, I can't really even point to you to studies that are looking very carefully at which program really resulted in better gains and in high school completion rates that are better than if you had used bilingual instruction, for example.
Yeah, one of the things that Tim Shanahan, who was here last time, was also a co-chair, not because of his linguistic diversity, but because of his statistical and research background, of the National Panel on Literacy in English, and then the National Panel on Second Language Acquisition.
Yeah, that you did with Diane August?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I was at a presentation of that, and one thing I remember him saying clearly was it was 1/10 of the research available for that panel as for the previous panel.
You mean for the one focused on ELL, so language minority? Yeah.
So it's a less mature research base, as you're saying, and that just backed it up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the thing is that there's been more, fortunately, and more researchers focused on this area. But even then, some of the studies are just very small scale, or it's very hard to really make these kind of comparisons. So the only thing we can really distill is that no one has really proved that using the native language is detrimental to English development, and that it doesn't help with native language development. So that's one that it would be very hard for someone to argue against. But the whole idea that just makes sense practically, use the language that you want them to be proficient in, that kind of makes sense intuitively to say, yeah, if you want them to know English well and have good English reading skills, let's focus just on English. Like, I think that makes sense to everyone as a whole, but linguistically speaking, that's not exactly the way it plays itself out. So if you're in a debate, let's say a political debate, it's much easier to appeal to the masses and saying, yeah, use the language that you want them to be proficient in, as opposed to going into linguistic structure, which is very kind of weird. Yeah.
Before the night is over, I know you wanted do you have your email or anything?
I do, and I can provide it to Aaron or Carl, and they can share it with you for sure. I know I gave it to one person already, but
to make sure that we were able to
research. Yes.
Our hands.
Do I have time for more questions?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I just want to share with everyone, and again, thank you for inviting me, and thank you so much. I think about research, but I always, the fear, like my colleague said, and we want to do the ESL, and we want to do all the right things. But a few months ago, I had an experience that changed my perspective to what you said. This family moved into the area, and the mom did a Code 13. So Code 13 means I don't want bilingual services. Two boys. The big one is doing fabulous. The little one was traumatized, to the point that he didn't want to talk to anyone. I mean, I could cry right now. Yeah. But I didn't believe it. I said, he's just, being malcriado. Seriously, this kid completely shut down. And then the teachers, the monolingual teachers, kind of knew of him because everyone was talking about him. And this is the first time in my life that I really saw a kid being traumatized by being put in a monolingual classroom. Yeah. Because that's not what he wanted. He wanted to talk Spanish. Now he's coming around because we put him back in the bilingual. But what you're saying is true.
Yeah. Yeah, and that reminds me of this whole, that's one of the myths or misconceptions that, immigrants in the past learn English just fine and they will sink or swim model and that's actually not true. Like, yeah, they learned it at some point, but there was a lot of traumatized individuals along the way, and they still needed language support to a large extent. So this whole notion that we kind of think like, yeah, in the past there was, it just kind of happened naturally and there was no problem, that's definitely a misconception. Yeah. Any other questions? Are we still good with time? Okay. I thought you were flagging me down. Yeah.
Well, you have desserts.
Oh, okay.
You're talking about vocabulary, and you may have said this, but can you throw out a few strategies that we should be focusing on? I mean, I'm sure we're all familiar with lots of vocabulary strategies, but in your body of research, if you had to name one or two top strategies that you would develop, could you share those?
Yeah, so let me tell you, one thing is that maybe many of you have heard of cognates. And I don't disagree with cognates. So cognates is a word that sounds very similar and has a similar meaning in both languages. And, we'll stick to Spanish here since that's what I've been doing. So like chocolate and chocolate, I mean, it almost sounds identical, right? That was one that even spelled identically. But the point is that there's been a lot of emphasis on the use of cognates with ELLs, and while I think that's good and a good approach, that is not a magic bullet. So there are false cognates, right? So the ones that sound similar but are not the same. Not that there's like a whole slew, but there's enough. So I just wanted to mention that because I know a lot of people might be familiar with that strategy, and that could work. It helps children with metalinguistic abilities, etc. But I think when you're thinking about vocabulary instruction for ELLs in particular, because I mentioned earlier too that some folks think, well, good instruction is good instruction for anybody, and that's probably good in terms of quality of instruction, but there's specific things for ELLs, like, all of you familiar with tiered vocabulary, Beck's work, right? Probably all of you are. And so that's just one very easy example about a tier 1 level word that for an ELL may not be a tier 1 level word. right? Because for a monolingual English speaker, something like house would presumably be tier 1, but for a student, someone like maybe like you brought up, house may not be at all a tier 1 level word and maybe considered tier 1 or 2. So you really need to think about the actual characteristics of your classroom and how much exposure they really have had to the language in order to even select vocabulary words. One of the strategies that's good across the board is selecting words that are going to be have multiple uses, so that they're not just abstract words that, okay, if you read a passage, this is one difficult word, and because it's difficult, let's focus on it. Maybe, seriously, that word doesn't matter that much because they're not going to see it a lot. But a word like factor, for example, that they're going to see maybe in an English text, and they're going to see in a math textbook and maybe in a science textbook, those are more interdisciplinary words that might be more bang for your buck in terms of instructional time allotted to teaching that word. There is, and this is not a plug for me because it's going to sound that way, but I have a book with Michael Grace and Diane August on teaching vocabulary to English language learners. And so that just came out last year. And as Carl was mentioning, the research base with ELLs in general is much thinner than it is for monolinguals in every aspect you can think about, including in vocabulary instruction. So what we did is we tried to distill it to the studies that have been focused on vocabulary for ELLs. And this is a book that's really anchored for practitioners. And it's from K to 12. So it's not very much for pre-K level. And really, I think would give you a good sense of a lot of strategies that are generally used with monolinguals, but ways that you can adapt them for English language learners in particular.